Today we'll be looking about how gravity affects astronomical orbits. Of course it creates it, but we want to talk about the direct implications. A seminal moment in the history of science is the publication of Kepler's 3 laws of planetary motion. Johannes Kepler was a mathematician who studied the best available data on the motion of planets and synthesized 3 laws, or really some descriptions. This is hard to oversell. It's what established the heliocentric theory and finally displaced the geocentric theory. It was a radical change in how people looked at the world and at the heavens. It came in sort of the early 1600s and was an important predecessor to Newton and helped inspire where he worked, which eventually helped establish all of what we call modern science. Kepler's laws are descriptive and come down to the following things. 1, each planet travels in an ellipse with the sun at one focus. So an ellipse is sort of a squashed circle. And the idea was they look something like this. I'm exaggerating them a lot. And then another planet would be like this, but they'd all share the sun at one of the foci. Each ellipse has another focus. Nothing interesting happens there. There's no physical meaning to it. It's just necessary for the existence of an ellipse. But one of the foci is shared by all the orbits, and the sun happens to be at it. This was a big change because people had thought that things would have to travel in circles because circles were considered to be perfect geometric objects, and therefore the heavens, which are perfect, should also follow them. And Kepler tried really hard, but found out that he couldn't do that, whereas with ellipses he could match the orbits pretty well. 2, planets travel faster when they're closer to the sun. So if we call this point A and this point B, and then C and D, the speeds would be that the velocity at A is more than the velocity at B, but also that that velocity of C is more than D. And then I haven't drawn it carefully, so it's hard to say, but if this distance is less than that distance, then C would be going faster at that moment than B is at that moment. In other words, it's an absolute thing. A given planet within its orbit travels faster than when it's closer to the sun than when it's further away, but also planets in different orbits that are closer to the sun travel faster than planets that are further away from the sun. And later in the year, we'll come back and say, oh, wait, that actually ends up being pretty obvious, but was not obvious at the time. Both of these two are sort of quasi-geometric things, and it's pretty easy to come up with a law of nature that causes things to move around the sun that produce ellipses that move faster when you're closer to the sun. There are some fundamental reasons why it's pretty easy to come up with lots of different force laws that would do that. But then Kepler had this third law. Kepler's third law is that there's a distinct relationship between the period of a planet's motion and its mean distance from the sun. So how long it takes to go around once, that's be one period, and what its average distance is from the sun. We're going to treat orbits as basically circular, even though Kepler says they're elliptical. They're very close to circular, and we don't lose a lot by assuming they are circular. And therefore, he's phrased his relation as that the square of the period is proportional to the cube of the distance. This is very bizarre. This thing comes out of nowhere. It just falls out of the data. There's no one who said ahead of time, oh, I would expect that. And so it's a challenge to anybody who's going to try and explain how the solar system works. Your theory has to produce this very specific relationship. This is the best data from NASA currently for the period and distance of flat Earth planets from the sun. So here you see the inner solar system and Mars. Well, inner solar system, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and even Pluto. We will not at the moment get into the wide-ranging debate as to whether Pluto should be considered a planet or not. And we've just plotted the period on one axis and the distance on the other. And there's certainly some relationship. It's not obvious what it is. But following Kepler, we're going to actually take the square of this and the cube of this and see what happens. So we've squared the period and cubed the distances for the inner solar system. And we find Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars. And they almost all lie directly on that line. The deviation is worse for Mars, which turns out to be the least circular, so that's not surprising. But even then, it's not by very much, considering how large these numbers are, squares and cubes. That's really not off by all that much. But it's really impressive when we keep going. Here, I've extended that same line. I've not refit it to the new data. I've extended it through The entire inner solar system lives over here, so this is the region over which that line was derived. And yet, Jupiter and Saturn lie directly on that line. Again, actually better even than, say, Mars. So this line is definitely predictive. This was the state of the world when Kepler was working. There were 5 naked eye planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And they all fit. And you're like, okay, that's not too, I mean, it's impressive, but you got 5 points, you make them fit on a line, that's not crazy. But in the 1780s, someone discovered a new planet moving out among the heavens. It required telescopes to see. It was actually extraordinarily difficult to see with the technology at the time. It was quite an achievement. That planet was named George, believe it or not, because it was discovered by an Englishman who named it after the King of England. The international community as a whole did not really feel like naming planets after kings of England, so eventually it was settled on that we would take names from Greek mythology to follow along with the existing ones that we know, and that planet was called Uranus. A little bit after the discovery of Uranus, not a little bit, I guess a couple of decades later, people discovered yet another planet called Neptune. The story of the discovery of Neptune is interesting, and we'll come back to it maybe, but right now I don't want to talk about it, just because it will distract from what we're doing right now. But they discovered this planet even further out from Uranus, mapped its period, and so on. And then finally, in the 30s, people went looking for another planet and found Pluto, which at the time people were sure was another planet, and mapped its distance and period. And what came out is pretty astonishing. These 3 planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, fit that line. It's still the same line. That line was based on these data points, and all of these other ones are after it. But even though these did not exist, people did not know about them at that time, they did not enter into Johannes Kepler's work at all, they still fall exactly on his line, which is pretty astonishing and is considered pretty remarkable validation of that model, that the Kepler's 3 laws are in fact true. Newton used his own 3 laws and the law of universal gravitation to explain Kepler's laws. He was motivated by this. He wasn't surprised when it came out that way, and he knew it would be a good proof of his laws. He said specifically consider circular orbits. The math does work out for elliptical orbits, but it gets a little bit more complicated and doesn't really add anything. So you just have to kind of figure out what the equivalent of the centrifugal acceleration is and what the equivalent of the velocity is and so on. But it turns out it ends up in the same place. It's just grungier. So he says we have a planet, you're orbiting, say, a star. The planet is orbiting a star at some distance r with some velocity v, and of course there's a force from it. And so F net has to equal ma. F net is the Newtonian gravitation, and a is the centrifugal acceleration. So we have gmm over r squared equals m times v squared over r. And then you do some stupid algebra tricks, and you get that the velocity is the square root of gm over r. But we also know that the velocity is going to be the distance over the time. The time is 1 period t, and the distance is 1 circumference 2 pi r. So I can say that 2 pi r over t is root gm over r. Square both sides, and I get 4 pi squared r squared over t squared. And over here I get gm over r. And then cross multiply, and I get that t squared is 4 pi squared over gm times r cubed. And we see that that is in fact some constant times r cubed. So this is Kepler's third. And it's important to understand it falls out of this pretty obviously. You don't really have to work on it very hard. You don't have to do very much. It's almost insultingly easy, which is sort of how Newton brandished it. He said, look at how powerful my law is, that it accidentally produces the Kepler law that we know has to happen. It's probably not the only thing that does work that way, but it works staggeringly well, and so people believed it. All right, 2 satellites have circular orbits with the same radius. Which one has a higher speed? And this is almost a trick question, because remember, v is root of gm over r, and since they have the same radius, they must have the same speed. Two identical satellites have different circular orbits. Which one has the higher speed? The one larger orbit, the one the smaller orbit, or they have the same? And again, v is root gm over r. So as r gets bigger, the denominator gets smaller, so v gets smaller. The one in the larger orbit is slower, or the one in the smaller orbit is faster. Which satellite takes a longer time to orbit the Earth? Remember that t squared is proportional to r cubed, so the bigger r, the bigger t. So the one with the larger orbit takes longer. Find the period in seconds for a satellite that orbits the Earth at a radial distance of 4.22 times 10 to the 7 meters. The mass of the Earth, by the way, is 5.97 times 10 to the 24 kilograms. So we start with our t is all this stuff that we found before, 4 pi squared over gm times r cubed, square rooted. We throw in a lot of grungy numbers, and do be careful. It's pretty easy to just make random weird errors on doing this. So be careful as you, for instance, are dividing by a product on your calculator. Make sure you put it in parentheses and so on. If you grind all that out, you get 86,317 seconds, which is 86,300 seconds to our proper sig figs. 86,400 seconds is 1 day. So this is something like 99.8% of 1 day. A satellite at this distance, or really just a little bit further out, would orbit the Earth at the same rate as the Earth spins, which means it would appear to someone on the ground to just hang directly above the point where it was, as long as it was over the equator. If we have, if you imagine looking from the North Pole, above the North Pole, and here's the Earth, and it's spinning like this, and you have your satellite, and the satellite is tracking out in orbit. This is not drawn to scale. But if the orbit takes the same time as 1 day, then in the time that you've gone around once, the satellite's gone around once, and in fact, at every moment, it looks directly above you. This is what we call geostationary orbits. It does have to be above the equator because you need to spin under it. If you're in any other orbit other than around the equator, then the Earth will rotate under it, so you won't get a stationary thing even if it takes 24 hours. But if you have a 24-hour period and you're over the equator, then the satellite appears to just hang there from the point of view of the Earth. It doesn't move across the sky. In the reverse, it means the same face of the Earth is always facing the satellite, so you can take images like for weather satellites or surveillance of the entire Earth as a stable platform. Technically half the Earth, but all right, and this little graphic illustrates the same thing, better drawn than I could have done it. The two satellites are co-rotating, and you can see there's a line drawn to the point on the Earth where they are. You can see the Earth spin as well. And so anybody on the Earth on those lines would see the satellites in the same place all the time. Of course, they would see the stars wheeling around them the other way, but they would see them at the same place. So you can use this because, for instance, you can build radio antenna that don't have to track. They can just be pointed at the satellite. And like I said, the satellite, on the other hand, can see the same side of the Earth all the time. All right. 1 day on Mars, which is 1 full rotation, takes 88,643 seconds. It's about 25 hours. And the mass of Mars is 6.4171 times 10 to the 23 kilograms. At what orbital radius should NASA place a satellite such that it is aerostationary, that is the equivalent to geostationary, that is, rotates at the same rate and gets stuck in the sky in Mars? Well, remember that t squared is 4 pi squared over gm times r cubed. So r is the cube root of gmt squared over 4 pi squared. We should plug in our numbers. Whoops. So we have the cube root of 6.67 times 10 to the minus 11 Newton meter square per kilogram square times the mass of Mars, which is 6.4171 times 10 to the 23rd kilograms. I need a lot more room. It's a big number. 6.67 times 10 to the minus 11 Newton meter square per kilogram square times the mass, which is 6.4171 times 10 to the 23 kilograms, times the period squared, which was given as 88,642, all of which is over 4 pi square, and then cube rooted, which apparently turns out to be 2.04 times 10 to the 7 meters, or about half as much as on Earth. All right. A particular star has 2 planets orbiting it. Planet X has mass m, orbits at a distance r, and speed v. Planet Y has mass 2m and orbits at a distance of 4r. What is planet Y's orbital speed? And we remember that v is root of 2 gm over r. So and remember that this m, this is the central object mass, the star in this case, not the planets. And so it doesn't matter what the planets are, and we can ignore that. We focus only on the distances, and we say, well, if we have 4r, but I put it under a radical, then I get 1/2 as much. So I get A.